It is a truth universally acknowledged.
I myself have noticed my growing resemblance
all that is
to a
gold
daffodil.
does not glitter.
So how I would die,
Not all.
though I had reason
Courage
enough
living
in
and
the
suffering
last few
for you
months.
believe.
If you want to rebel, rebel from inside the system.
But because they tell us that dragons
I'm your
can
host
be
Vicky
beaten.
from Miss Vicky's Bookcase. Let's begin our story together. Hello and welcome. I am kind of excited to share my review with you today, and we're going to be doing the review of Ready Player 2 by Ernest Cline, and it is the audio review, which is only a little bit different from a normal book review. I just want to add in a little bit about how I felt about the audio. So that being said, we're going to take the plunge, and we're just going to do a little bit of a biography of Ernest Cline, because it's always worth knowing about the author and why they're coming from where they're coming, if that makes sense. So Ernest Cline was born and raised in Ohio, and he was a youth in the 70s and 80s, which makes total sense for at least Ready Player 1 and a little bit of Ready Player 2. So it makes sense. And also that Cline was addicted to video games and movies, especially Star Wars, the movies of John Hughes, and tabletop role-playing game Dungeons and Dragons. He's also worked in information technology in his 20s and worked on screenwriting during his spare time. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a flavour for him. And I have to say, knowing what I do about both of his books, Ready Player 1 and Ready Player 2, I can see exactly how his life has influenced those books. So that's really interesting. Now, because I'm reviewing the audio version of Ready Player 2, I thought I'd talk about the narrator, and that's Will Wheaton. He does a 5-star job of Ready Player 2. He also narrated Ready Player 1. So if you enjoyed Ready Player 1 with Will Wheaton, you're definitely going to enjoy Ready Player 2. Will Wheaton does a fantastic job. Well done, Will Wheaton. It's great. So other than that, I do need to give you a couple of trigger warnings. If you're going to read or listen to this book, there are some warnings for sex, violence, and I would go with it's a kind of like medium swearing. But again, if you've listened or read Ready Player 1, you're already be aware of all that kind of jazz. So now on to the actual review. And in some ways, I just don't know where to start with this. Did Ready Player 1 need a sequel? No, it didn't. Is Ready Player 2 a good sequel? I'm tutting a lot because it's really difficult. So let's start with the first thing, the characters. We do have Wade as our main protagonist again, and he is quite neurotic at the very beginning of this book, and it was so painful, his situation and what he had done in the time after Ready Player 1. And that was actually quite interesting because it wasn't the perfect life, in fact very far from his perfect life, and it was so painful. I felt so much sympathy for him, and I did stop listening to this a couple of times because to me it was a very painful situation, and I felt so much fellow feeling that it was almost unbearable to listen to, if that makes sense. And I think if I was reading it, I probably would have put the book totally down for at least a couple of days before going back to it, but I did persist, and it kind of did get better from that perspective, but it was definitely like a train wreck, watching his character basically crash and burn socially and kind of letting power a little bit go to his head, but for very specific reasons, and I can see where he's coming from with those reasons. And he's turned into a very socially awkward man, let's put it that way. And I did feel like Artemis was very much on the angry, not giving in to any situation, and I found her very, very grating right at the beginning, and then her transition from her character and her situation right at the beginning, when the big thing happens. I'm trying not to give you any spoilers because it's worth it, because it kind of does build it up, but when this big situation happens, her character just totally flips back to what she was like in Ready Player 1, and that really kind of set my teeth on edge a little bit, and there was no give in her right at the beginning, and that just really annoyed me and frustrated me. H and Shoto, they were very much absent in Wade's life, and it kind of showed, and they kind of more minor characters this time, really, I felt, than kind of main characters. it felt a bit of a lessening, if that makes sense, which kind of neatly goes into the atmosphere of the whole book. And as I said, at the beginning, the very first quarter of the book, I would say, it was very much a painful atmosphere. You were getting to know what happened to the characters in Ready Player One. It was almost a kind of good synopsis of Ready Player One, if that makes sense, as in what had happened. It didn't really go into it that much, but it was a good segue into what would happen next. And the atmosphere for the second part, where the big thing happens and Wade is against the test of time with this, and he had so few hours compared to Ready Player One. It was trying to crank up the tension all the way through it, and as it was getting worse and worse and worse, and as these situations kept happening, it did get worse, and the atmosphere was very tense. It just felt almost a little bit false, but at the same time, I can see where they're coming from, and I did feel very immersed in it, and I could feel that it was trying to push it out. There was just something a little bit lacking though, so for the atmosphere, kind of, if I was giving it out of 10, it would probably be a 7, because I don't think he quite got it right in my mind. Now, the writing is as great as ever. I really enjoyed the way it was written. It was very easygoing, and it did have, as it did in Ready Player One, a nice set of hodgepodge of information and trivia that I'm sure is interesting to a lot of people out there. And it was interesting, the different trivia that was picked for this book and the interesting subject. I'm kind of glad, and this is definite spoiler, that Lord of the Rings, or rather that kind of era, was featured in it. And also interesting to see again Wade's failings in this book, because it's not that he was perfect in Ready Player One, but it's kind of like he didn't learn really in Ready Player One, and he was very distracted by the world around him and outside him, and it did have, I would say, definitely depression and a lot of anxiety going on. So that was very well written from that perspective. I did enjoy that kind of writing, which kind of leads to the plot. And I think this is where it almost fails quite badly, and I think a lot of people are going to be slating Ready Player 2, because I genuinely don't think we needed a Ready Player 2 in some ways, but at the same time, actually, once I got over the first quarter and Wade being the person he is at the very beginning, I kind of enjoyed the rest of the plot, and again the tension was doing really well, the stakes were really high, and it wasn't just about Wade and his friends and the stakes being just Wade and his friends and just winning over the Sixers. It was totally different, and it was a different protagonist, and in some ways the protagonist, it's not that I was disappointed in the protagonist in Anorak, I'm sorry, that was the other spoiler, and I can see how that corruption became the protagonist and how he would think certain things because of what other people did. It's very interesting chain reaction and how these things happened. If someone did this, then this is what happened in the future. I thought that was very, very well done, and I did enjoy it from that perspective. I'm just struggling with it a little bit, the fact that I just don't think it needed to be added. And I will say, the very end of the book, I thought it was a well thought out one, and I was very interested to see what would happen, because I thought Wade was going to do something, and I didn't see how he was not going to do this thing, and actually it didn't happen. And in some ways I was really pleased, because I felt like that was something that shouldn't have happened, because they were too far gone in society for him to really pull the plug, I think is more what I'm trying to say. And I was very interested in how they actually got around that, and I was very interested in the immortality side of things, and the ending is something I quite enjoyed, and I'm glad that it ended on an upbeat again, but it was a bit odd, if that makes sense, and I really don't want to spoil what the ending is because I quite liked it. But at the same time, to me, it was a little bit odd, but I can see exactly where he was coming from, and it was a very positive thing. So just in case you're wondering, it is kind of a positive ending. I feel like that's also a spoiler, so my apologies, but at least you don't know the specifics, if that makes sense. So did it keep me interested to read all of this book? It did and it didn't. And again, I think it's the very first quarter that I'm really stuck on, if you can't tell already, in the fact that it just felt like, as I said, it's just the painfulness, because I felt like I was him a little bit, not in the what his reaction was, but kind of like feeling the isolation, the now that they've done this big thing where they won the competition, and it's the aftermath that was quite interesting. But to me, it was a very painful aspect in the book. So it did kind of keep me intrigued, but at the same time, it was really off-putting for me personally. It probably isn't going to be off-putting for you, but just be aware it was a little bit off-putting. As we got further into the book, it was still really intriguing. It just didn't catch my attention as well as Ready Player One. Ready Player One, I just was utterly enthralled, and to me it's one of those great masterpieces that I've really enjoyed. Ready Player Two is definitely just not there. I think it's dropped a notch or two, but I think that's again because Ready Player One was so good that I think it's gotten sequel syndrome, if that makes sense, and the intrigue just wasn't quite as good. But moving on then to the logic of the book, did it all fit well together? Did it go bum 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 in a very logical way? And I would say in general, yes it did. It also had those nice twists and turns that I really like, which kind of is the going back to intrigue a little bit, where it did have twists and turns that I kind of wasn't expecting. And the characters did in general react the way I was kind of almost expecting them to, except for maybe Artemis. Artemis is the one that logic almost fails a little bit, because she was this one stubborn person right at the beginning and she was so angry, and then the coin kind of flipped and she was back almost to the person in Ready Player One. And in some ways I can understand that, because this big thing happened and all her family, or a chosen family really, were in trouble, and she was there to help them, and it wasn't as resentful as it could have been, but it was one of those where it was almost a total about face, which I'm kind of a little bit frustrated by. I mean, she is the one that I find the logic fails a bit. Everybody else kind of played to it mostly, with the character of H and Shoto to me a little bit toned down, but everyone generally played to their character, as I said, other than Artemis. But I used to like Artemis, and now I'm like, do you know what? I don't actually like you anymore. I've found you stubborn and just frustrating, and her stubbornness and the O and I just found her, I don't find her refreshing. I just found her really annoying, and I don't think she handled it very well at all. And again, that's probably because her age, and I keep forgetting that they're still really young in their early 20s, and of course they always think they're invulnerable, which is okay, because that's what people when they're younger do think. And it's one of those where, as I said, Artemis just kind of riles me up a little bit, even though I know what she's going about and that I can see where she's coming from. It just annoys me. Very much so. Anyway, moving on from that, because I don't want to rant about it too much, and that is my enjoyment of the book. And in general, I actually did enjoy it. There's nothing wrong with having a sequel, even though we didn't ask for it, and it does work. I'll give it that, full credit. The book does work, and I don't think it really adds to it, but I did enjoy it, just not as much as Ready Player One. So I'm giving it a solid 4 stars. Maybe even down to like a 3.5 a little bit, because I didn't enjoy it as much as Ready Player One, which is a 5-star in my book. But that's not to say I didn't enjoy it. So if you're looking for something that's sci-fi and you really loved Ready Player One, then I do recommend reading Ready Player Two. If you can manage to get over the different humps and the painfulness right at the beginning, and you understand that it's just not as good as Ready Player One. I'm really sorry, Ernest Cline. I did enjoy it, but it just wasn't as good. So there is that. Now I will say there is one thing I did want to mention in this, and I'm very intrigued because he kind of sets it up not for Wade to be carried on in a third book, but I have to say there is a character called Lohengrin in there, and they go on a quest for Wade, and you don't know what happens in this quest other than they do come through. And I would love to see the story of how Lohengrin got that object and how that all happened. And I think that would be a really great story if he's going to end up doing a third book. You never know, he possibly could. But I really liked the thought of that, because that sounds totally epic. And again, that's like a Ready Player One situation, but it would be different. And it'd be nice to see something else set in this world almost, because it's very interesting how it all happens. So have I got 5 words to describe this book? I do, but I kind of really struggle to get the 5th one. So the 5th one's a little bit odd, but I think I got there. So I've got 5 words, and they are fun, high stakes, painful, frustrating, and family. And by the term family, I mean the fact that it was all about keeping the family together, but in a very kind of like futuristic, odd way, if that makes sense. You'll understand what I mean when you read the book. Hopefully this has given you some idea as to whether you want to be able to read the book. I try to keep it spoiler free. It's very hard though, because there are some things that I want to talk about that probably would send me on a total rant. But the main gist really is it's not as good as Ready Player One, and it wasn't a necessary sequel. I, however, did enjoy it, but it wasn't as good as Ready Player One, and that's something you just need to be aware of. And if you just take it as a fun book that's a sequel, hopefully it won't upset you when some things happen and situations happen, because it is a little bit frustrating, but definitely worth a read in different respects, especially if you just keep thinking it's just a fun read, it's just a fun read. Anyway, I will see you in the next podcast, and if you have read Ready Player 2, feel free to drop me a message at my Instagram page at Miss Vicky's Bookcase and let me know how you felt about the whole Ready Player 2 and the sequel, and whether you thought they should have done it or not. Having read it myself, I'm like, nah, they should have just kept it to one, but I did enjoy it. That's my tagline. Anyway, I'll see you next time. Bye!
Morpork, pearl of cities.
People really are
This
like houses
is not.
with vast rooms and tiny
Libraries were full of ideas, perhaps the most dangerous and
She
powerful.
delighted in the smell of the ink, the rough feel of the paper.
Had commented once that Neil had a
Story that
gift
can
for
only
making
be
someone want
enjoyed
to
by
punch
children
him.
is not a good children's
The very
story.
weak-minded
in the sight.
refused to be influenced by literature and poetry.